The storm had been brewing for 3 days over Dustridge, and tonight it finally unleashed its fury. Lightning split the sky like God's own whip, illuminating the weathered face of the man they called Cowman. At 43, Jake Cowman Morrison had seen enough storms, both in the sky and in men's hearts, to last several lifetimes. His ranch sat on the outskirts of town, a modest spread that he'd built with his own hands after returning from the war 15 years ago. The townspeople had given him the nickname Cowman, not out of respect, but because he preferred the company of cattle to people. And after what this town had done to him, who could blame him? Thunder crashed overhead as Cowman secured the last of his livestock in the barn. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, each motion born from years of solitary routine. The rain hammered against the tin roof like bullets, a sound that still made his jaw clench after all these years. As he trudged back toward his modest farmhouse, something caught his eye. A shadow moved near his kitchen window, too small to be a man, too deliberate to be an animal. Cowman's hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 on his hip, but he didn't draw it. Instead, he crept closer, his boots silent despite the storm's chaos. Through the rain-streaked window, he saw a boy, couldn't be more than 12, frantically stuffing bread and dried meat into a burlap sack. The child's clothes hung in tatters, his face gaunt with hunger. But what struck Cowman most was the desperation in the boy's movements. This wasn't the casual theft of a troublemaker, this was survival. Any reasonable man would have burst through that door, grabbed the thief, and marched him straight to Sheriff Dalton. The law was clear, and in a town like Dustridge, theft was met with swift justice. But as Cowman watched the boy's trembling hands struggle with the food, something stirred in his chest, a feeling he'd buried deep 15 years ago. The boy finished his desperate gathering and turned toward the door. Cowman had seconds to decide. He could confront the child, demand answers, assert his rights as a property owner. Instead, he stepped back into the shadows and watched as the small figure slipped out into the storm. But Cowman's night was far from over. Something about the boy's urgency, the careful way he'd selected only essentials, gnawed at him. This wasn't random theft. This was a mission. And 15 years of living on the edges of society had taught Cowman to recognize desperation when he saw it. Against every instinct that had kept him alive and isolated, Cowman pulled his coat tight and followed the boy into the storm. The child moved through the town's back alleys with the skill of someone who'd learned to stay invisible. He avoided the main streets, ducked under overhangs, and seemed to know exactly where every puddle and loose board lay hidden in the darkness. Dustridge at night was a different creature than during the day. The respectable facades fell away, revealing the rot underneath. Cowman followed the boy past the saloon, where drunken laughter mixed with the storm's howl, past the boarding house where desperate women sold what little they had left, past the church where Reverend Matthews preached charity on Sundays, but turned away the hungry on Mondays. The boy led him to the oldest part of town, where the original settlers had built their homes before gold fever and cattle money had shifted the town's center. Most of these buildings stood empty now, their windows boarded up, their foundations crumbling. It was here, in a lean-to shack that barely deserved the name shelter, that the boy finally stopped. Cowman crouched behind a pile of rotting lumber and watched as the boy slipped inside. Through a gap in the boards, he could see the faint glow of a candle, and then he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. A small voice, weak and feverish, calling out, "Tommy, Tommy, is that you?" The boy, Tommy, knelt beside what appeared to be a makeshift bed. "I'm here, Sarah. I brought food. Real food this time." Cowman's throat tightened as he saw the second child, a girl who couldn't be more than 8, her face pale and drawn with illness. She was so thin that her bones seemed to press against her skin like bird wings. "I'm not hungry," the little girl whispered, but Tommy was already breaking the bread into small pieces, coaxing her to eat. "You have to eat, Sarah. You have to get strong so we can leave this place." "Where will we go, Tommy?" The boy's voice cracked as he answered, "Somewhere they don't know about Papa, somewhere they don't care what he did." Cowman felt the ground shift beneath him. These weren't just any hungry children. They were the offspring of someone the town had judged and found wanting. In Dustridge, the sins of the father were visited upon the children with biblical certainty. As he watched Tommy tend to his sister with the gentle care of someone far older than his years, Cowman made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't walk away. Not from this. Not again. The storm began to subside as Cowman made his way back to his ranch. But the tempest in his mind was just beginning. He'd spent 15 years avoiding the complications that came with caring about other people. He'd built walls around his heart higher than the mountains that surrounded their valley. But tonight, watching a 12-year-old boy sacrifice everything for his dying sister, those walls had started to crack. By morning, the whole town would know about the theft. Sheriff Dalton would investigate, ask questions, demand answers. The respectable citizens of Dustridge would want justice served, order maintained. They'd want the thief found and punished, regardless of his age or circumstances. But they didn't know what Cowman knew. They hadn't seen what he'd seen. And for the first time in 15 years, Jake Morrison found himself caring more about doing what was right than doing what was safe. As dawn broke over Dustridge, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Cowman stood at his kitchen window, staring at the empty space where his food had been. The smart thing would be to report the theft and let the law handle it. The safe thing would be to mind his own business and protect the quiet life he'd built. But as he thought about Tommy's trembling hands and Sarah's fevered whispers, Cowman realized that some things mattered more than being smart or safe. Some things were worth the risk. The question was, what was he willing to sacrifice to save two children that the town had already written off as lost? Sheriff Bill Dalton had been keeping the peace in Dustridge for 8 years, and he prided himself on knowing every soul within 20 miles of town. So when Jake Morrison walked into his office that Tuesday morning, hat in hand and wearing an expression Dalton had never seen before, the sheriff knew something significant was about to unfold. "Sheriff," Cowman began, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of tension, "I need to report a theft." Dalton leaned back in his chair, studying the man before him. In all the years he'd known Cowman, the rancher had never once sought help from the law. He handled his own problems, kept to himself, and expected the same courtesy from others. "What was taken, Jake?" "Food, mostly. Bread, dried meat, some canned goods. Happened during the storm last night. You see who did it?" Cowman paused, and in that pause, Dalton sensed there was more to this story than a simple theft report. "I did. It was a boy. Couldn't have been more than 12 or 13. You know this boy?" "I believe so. I think it was Tommy Fletcher." The name hit the office like a physical blow. Dalton's expression darkened, and he leaned forward, suddenly very interested. "Robert Fletcher's boy?" "The same." Sheriff Dalton stood and walked to his window, looking out at the main street where respectable citizens went about their morning business. The Fletcher name was poison in this town, and everyone knew why. "Jake, you sure about this? Tommy Fletcher's been missing for near 2 months now. Ever since his father—" Dalton let the sentence hang in the air. "Ever since his father was hanged for murder," Cowman finished. "Yes, I'm sure." The story of Robert Fletcher was one that Dustridge preferred to forget, but couldn't. 3 months ago, Fletcher had been accused of killing Samuel Hartwell during a dispute over a mining claim. The evidence had been circumstantial at best, but Fletcher was an outsider, a drifter who'd settled on the edge of town with his 2 young children after his wife died of consumption. When Hartwell turned up dead with Fletcher's knife nearby, the town's judgment was swift and final. Fletcher maintained his innocence right up until the rope tightened around his neck, claiming he'd been framed. But in a town where Samuel Hartwell's family had roots going back to the founding, the word of a drifter meant nothing. "Those children disappeared right after the hanging," Dalton continued. "Most folks figured they'd moved on, maybe found relatives somewhere. They're still here, Sheriff. Living rough, from what I could see." Dalton turned back to face Cowman, his expression troubled. "Jake, I have to ask, why didn't you stop the boy? Why didn't you bring him in yourself?" It was the question Cowman had been dreading, because the honest answer would reveal more about his intentions than he was ready to share. Boy looked half-starved. Figured it could wait until morning. That's not like you, Jake. You've never been one to let sentiment cloud your judgment. Cowman met the sheriff's gaze steadily. Maybe I'm getting soft in my old age. Before Dalton could respond, the office door burst open and Mayor Harrison strode in, followed by 3 of the town's most prominent citizens: Dr. Marcus Webb, banker Edmund Carruthers, and store owner Mrs. Abigail Thornton. Word traveled fast in Dustridge, and news of the Fletcher boys' return had already begun to spread. "Sheriff Dalton," Mayor Harrison began without preamble, "we need to discuss this Fletcher situation immediately." "Gentlemen, Mrs. Thornton," Dalton nodded. "I was just taking Mr. Morrison's statement about the theft." Dr. Webb, a thin man with sharp features and sharper opinions, stepped forward. "The theft is secondary, Sheriff. The real issue is that we have the children of a convicted murderer living like wild animals in our town. It's a disgrace and a danger." "Now hold on, Doc," Cowman interjected. "They're just children." Mrs. Thornton, whose general store served as the unofficial headquarters for town gossip, fixed Cowman with a withering stare. "Children who carry their father's blood, Mr. Morrison. Bad blood has a way of showing itself. The boy stole from you, Jake," Banker Carruthers added. "That proves the criminal tendencies are already manifesting." Cowman felt his temper rising, but he kept his voice level. The boy was hungry. When did feeding a starving child become a crime in this town? "When that child chooses theft over honest work," Mayor Harrison replied. "There are proper channels for charity in Dustridge. The church, the women's auxiliary. If these children needed help, they should have asked for it. And would they have received it?" Cowman asked quietly. The silence that followed was answer enough. Sheriff Dalton cleared his throat. "Regardless of our feelings about their father, we have a legal obligation to these children. They're minors, and they've been living without proper supervision for months." "Exactly," Dr. Webb agreed. "They need to be placed in an institution where they can receive proper care and moral guidance. There's an orphanage in Denver that specializes in difficult cases." Cowman's blood ran cold. He'd heard about that orphanage, a grim place where unwanted children were worked like slaves and beaten into submission. "You're talking about sending them away because of who their father was. We're talking about protecting this community," Mrs. Thornton snapped. "Robert Fletcher brought nothing but trouble to Dustridge, and his children are a constant reminder of that shame." "What shame?" Cowman demanded. "The shame of hanging a man who might have been innocent?" The room erupted in angry voices, but Mayor Harrison's shout cut through the chaos. "That's enough! Robert Fletcher was tried and convicted by a jury of his peers. The matter is settled." "Is it?" Cowman asked. "Because it seems to me that if you were all so certain of his guilt, you wouldn't be so afraid of 2 hungry children." Dr. Webb's face flushed red. "No one is afraid, Morrison. We're being practical. These children have no future here. The kindest thing we can do is send them somewhere they can start fresh." "The kindest thing," Cowman repeated slowly, "would be to take care of them ourselves." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Mayor Harrison was the first to recover his voice. "Are you volunteering, Mr. I. Morrison?" Cowman hadn't planned to make such a declaration, but now that the words were out, he realized they felt right. More right than anything he'd said in years. "Maybe I am." Mrs. Thornton laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. "You? A bachelor who's barely spoken to another human being in 15 years? What do you know about raising children?" "More than you might think," Cowman replied quietly. Sheriff Dalton studied Cowman's face carefully. "Jake, you need to think about what you're saying. Taking in these children would mean taking on their father's reputation as well. Are you prepared for that?" Cowman looked around the room at the faces of Dustridge's leading citizens, faces filled with fear, prejudice, and a desperate need to maintain their comfortable certainties. He thought about Tommy Fletcher, risking everything to steal food for his dying sister. He thought about little Sarah, so weak she could barely lift her head. "Sheriff," he said finally, "I've been carrying a reputation in this town for 15 years. Adding a little more weight to it won't break my back." Mayor Harrison stepped forward, his voice taking on a threatening tone. "Morrison, you need to understand the position you're putting yourself in. This town has been through enough turmoil over the Fletcher family. We won't tolerate any more disruption." "What kind of disruption are you worried about, Mayor? The disruption of 2 children having enough to eat? The disruption of showing a little Christian charity? The disruption," Dr. Webb said coldly, "of having our judgment questioned by someone who wasn't even here when Fletcher committed his crime." "I was here," Cowman said quietly. "I was here when you arrested him. I was here when you tried him. And I was here when you hanged him. I saw it all. Then you know he was guilty," Mrs. Thornton declared. Cowman met her gaze without flinching. "I know he said he was innocent. I know his children believe he was innocent. And I know that sometimes the truth isn't as clear as we'd like it to be." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was heavy with unspoken accusations and long-buried doubts. Sheriff Dalton finally broke the tension. "Jake, I need to ask you directly. Are you formally requesting custody of the Fletcher children?" Cowman took a deep breath. He was about to cross a line that would change everything, not just for Tommy and Sarah Fletcher, but for himself and his place in this town. But as he thought about the alternative, those children shipped off to an orphanage or left to starve in the shadows, the choice became clear. "Yes, Sheriff, I am." The declaration sent shockwaves through the room. Mayor Harrison's face turned purple with rage. Dr. Webb began sputtering protests, and Mrs. Thornton looked as if she'd been personally insulted. But Sheriff Dalton just nodded slowly. "Then I'll need to interview the children and assess their condition before making any official determination." "Of course," Cowman agreed. "But Sheriff, when you do interview them, remember that they're scared children who've been living like fugitives for months. They might not be immediately trusting of authority figures. Are you telling me how to do my job, Morrison? I'm telling you that those children have been through hell, and they deserve to be treated with kindness." As the town leaders filed out of the sheriff's office, their faces grim with determination, Cowman realized that he'd just declared war on the most powerful people in Dustridge. They wouldn't give up easily, and they had resources he couldn't match. But he also had something they didn't: the absolute certainty that he was doing the right thing. The question was whether that would be enough. The abandoned shack where Tommy and Sarah Fletcher had been hiding sat in the oldest part of Dustridge, where broken dreams and forgotten promises gathered like tumbleweeds. When Sheriff Dalton, accompanied by Cowman and Dr. Webb, approached the ramshackle structure the next morning, the silence was so complete it seemed to press against their eardrums. "You sure they're in there?" Dalton whispered, his hand resting unconsciously on his gun belt. Cowman nodded, though his stomach churned with worry. He'd spent a sleepless night wondering if his public declaration had frightened the children into running. "They're here. Tommy's too smart to leave his sister when she's this sick." Dr. Webb snorted dismissively. "Smart enough to steal, apparently." "Smart enough to survive," Cowman corrected, his voice carrying a warning edge. Sheriff Dalton approached the makeshift door, 3 boards held together with rope and prayer. "Tommy Fletcher, this is Sheriff Dalton. I need to speak with you." The silence stretched on, broken only by the morning wind whistling through the gaps in the walls. Then, so quietly they almost missed it, came a young voice. "Go away." "Son, I'm not here to hurt you. Mr. Morrison here says you might need some help." "We don't need help from anyone." Tommy's voice was stronger now, but Cowman could hear the fear underneath the defiance. "Tommy," Cowman called out, "it's Jake Morrison, the man whose food you took. I'm not angry about that." "I want to help you and your sister." A long pause. Then, "Why?" It was such a simple question, but it cut straight to the heart of everything. Why was Cowman willing to risk his reputation, his peace, his carefully constructed isolation for 2 children he barely knew? "Because," Cowman said, surprised by the emotion in his own voice, "everyone deserves a chance." The door opened slowly, revealing Tommy Fletcher in the harsh light of day. Cowman had to suppress a gasp at the boy's condition. He was even thinner than he'd appeared in the storm, his clothes hanging like rags on his skeletal frame. But it was his eyes that truly broke Cowman's heart. Old eyes in a young face, eyes that had seen too much and trusted too little. "She's real sick," Tommy said without preamble. "I tried to take care of her, but she keeps getting worse." Dr. Webb pushed past Cowman and Dalton, his medical bag in hand. Whatever his personal feelings about the Fletcher family, his professional instincts had taken over. "Let me see her, boy." Tommy hesitated, then stepped aside. The interior of the shack was even worse than Cowman had imagined. A few moth-eaten blankets served as bedding, empty cans and food scraps were scattered about, and the smell of sickness hung heavy in the air. Sarah Fletcher lay on a pile of rags in the corner, her breathing shallow and labored. She was so pale she seemed almost translucent, and when she opened her eyes to look at the strangers, Cowman saw the same premature wisdom that marked her brother's gaze. Dr. Webb knelt beside her, his examination gentle despite his earlier harsh words. After several minutes, he sat back on his heels, his expression grave. "How long has she been like this?" he asked Tommy. "About a month, maybe longer. She was getting better for a while after Papa died. But then the cold weather came, and we couldn't keep warm, and she started coughing again." "Has she been eating?" Tommy's face flushed with shame. "I try to find food, but sometimes there isn't enough. I always make sure she eats first, but you're both starving," Dr. Webb finished bluntly. He stood and walked to where Dalton and Cowman waited. "She has pneumonia, possibly consumption. Without proper care, she won't last another week." The words hit Cowman like a physical blow. "What does she need?" "Medicine, warmth, proper nutrition, and rest. Things these children haven't had in months." Dr. Webb's voice was clinical, but Cowman caught something else underneath, a hint of shame, perhaps, or regret. Sheriff Dalton stepped forward. "Tommy, I need to ask you some questions about what happened to your father." The boy's entire body tensed. "He didn't do it. He didn't kill Mr. Hartwell. How can you be so sure?" "Because he was with us that night. Sarah was having one of her bad spells, and Papa stayed up all night taking care of her. He never left the house." Dr. Webb frowned. "That's not what the witnesses said at the trial." "What witnesses?" Tommy demanded. "Nobody saw Papa do anything because he didn't do it." "The knife, son," Dalton said gently. "Your father's knife was found next to the body." Tommy's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like the child he was, instead of the hardened survivor he'd been forced to become. "Papa lost that knife weeks before Mr. Hartwell died. He was real upset about it because it was the only thing he had left from his own father." "Lost it where?" Cowman asked. "At the mining camp. He was working there sometimes, doing odd jobs. He came home one day and said his knife was gone, probably fell out of his belt somewhere." Sheriff Dalton and Dr. Webb exchanged glances. This was new information that hadn't come out at the trial. "Tommy," Dalton continued, "why didn't your father mention this during his trial?" The boy's face hardened again. "He tried to, but nobody wanted to listen. They'd already made up their minds." From the corner came a weak voice. "Tommy? Who are these men?" Tommy rushed to his sister's side, taking her small hand in his. "It's okay, Sarah. They're here to help." Sarah's fever-bright eyes fixed on Cowman. "Are you the man Tommy took food from?" "I am. I'm sorry. We didn't want to steal, but I was so hungry." And Tommy said, "You don't need to apologize," Cowman said, kneeling beside her makeshift bed. "You did what you had to do to survive. Papa always said stealing was wrong, but Tommy said Papa would understand because I was sick." "Your papa would be proud of how your brother took care of you," Cowman assured her. Tears began to flow down Sarah's thin cheeks. "I miss Papa. He used to tell us stories about when we'd have our own ranch someday with horses and everything." Dr. Webb cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Sheriff, we need to make a decision about these children's immediate care. The girl needs medical attention now." "I can take them to my ranch," Cowman offered. "It's warm, there's plenty of food, and—" "Absolutely not," came a sharp voice from the doorway. Mayor Harrison stood there with Mrs. Thornton and Banker Carruthers, their faces set in determined opposition. "These children are wards of the state now. They'll be properly cared for at the county facility until arrangements can be made for their permanent placement." Tommy scrambled to his feet, placing himself protectively between the adults and his sister. We're not going anywhere with you people. You killed our papa. Your father was a murderer, Mrs. Thornton said coldly. And you're both old enough to understand that actions have consequences. He wasn't a murderer, Tommy shouted. And even if he was, what did Sarah ever do to you? She's just a little girl. Mayor Harrison stepped forward. That little girl is the daughter of a convicted killer. Do you think the good families of this town want their children associating with her? Do you think any decent person would hire her when she's older, knowing her background? So you'd rather she die? Cowman asked quietly. We'd rather she be raised properly, away from the shadow of her father's crimes, Dr. Webb replied. The orphanage in Denver has experience with difficult cases. Difficult cases, Cowman repeated. Is that what we're calling hungry children now? Sheriff Dalton held up his hands. Everyone calm down. I'm the legal authority here, and I'll make the decision about these children's placement. Actually, Sheriff, Mayor Harrison said with a cold smile, I've been in contact with Judge Morrison in the county seat. He's agreed to expedite the custody hearing. The children will be removed to county care this afternoon, pending the hearing tomorrow. Cowman felt the walls closing in. You can't do this. These children have been through enough. We're doing what's best for everyone involved, Mrs. Thornton declared, including the children themselves. Best for everyone? Tommy's voice cracked with emotion. Best for you, maybe. You just want us gone so you don't have to think about what you did to Papa. What we did, Banker Carruthers said stiffly, was ensure that justice was served. Justice? Sarah's weak voice carried clearly in the sudden silence. Papa said justice was about truth. He said the truth always comes out eventually. Sometimes, child, Mayor Harrison said with false gentleness, the truth is too painful for children to understand. I understand plenty, Sarah replied, her fever-bright eyes fixed on the mayor's face. I understand that you were scared of Papa because he was different. I understand that you needed someone to blame for Mr. Hartwell's death. And I understand that you don't care if Tommy and I die as long as you don't have to feel guilty about what you did. The adults stood in stunned silence. This pale, dying child had just spoken truths that none of them wanted to acknowledge. Dr. Webb was the first to recover. The child is delirious from fever. We need to get her to proper medical facilities immediately. No, Tommy said firmly. We're not going with you. You don't have a choice, son, Sheriff Dalton said sadly. I'm sorry, but the law is the law. Then the law is wrong, Cowman declared. And I won't stand by and watch you destroy these children to protect your own consciences. Mayor Harrison's eyes narrowed. Be very careful, Morrison. You're walking a dangerous line. Good, Cowman replied. I've been playing it safe for too long. As the county officials prepared to take Tommy and Sarah away, Cowman made a silent promise. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The truth that Sarah spoke of, the truth that would vindicate her father and expose the town's guilt, was out there somewhere, and he was going to find it. 3 days had passed since Tommy and Sarah Fletcher were taken to the county facility, and Cowman had barely slept. The image of Sarah's pale face as they carried her away haunted him, along with Tommy's desperate promise that he would protect his sister no matter what. The custody hearing was scheduled for this morning, and everyone in Dustridge knew the outcome was predetermined. Judge Morrison, no relation to Cowman despite the shared name, was known for his strict adherence to social order. The Fletcher children would be shipped off to the Denver orphanage, and the town could finally put the unpleasant business behind them. But Cowman had spent those 3 sleepless days doing something the good citizens of Dustridge hadn't expected: investigating. And what he'd discovered would shake the town to its very foundations. The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. Old Pete Hawkins, the town drunk who spent his days sweeping out the saloon for whiskey money, had approached Cowman the previous evening with information that changed everything. Heard you been asking questions about Robert Fletcher, Pete had wheezed, his breath reeking of cheap liquor and desperation. That's right. You know something, Pete? Maybe. Depends on whether you got any money for an old man's memories. Cowman had given Pete $5, more money than the old drunk had seen in months, and in return received a story that made his blood run cold. I was sleeping it off behind the mining office that night Hartwell died, Pete had begun. Heard voices arguing, so I looked around the corner. Saw Hartwell with another man, but it wasn't Fletcher. Who was it? Couldn't see his face clear, but I recognized the voice. Been hearing it in church every Sunday for years. Pete, who did you see? Dr. Webb. He and Hartwell were going at it something fierce about money. Hartwell was saying Webb owed him for keeping quiet about something. Webb was saying he'd already paid enough. The revelation had hit Cowman like a thunderbolt. Dr. Marcus Webb, one of the town's most respected citizens, arguing with Samuel Hartwell on the night of the murder. But Pete's story got worse. Then Webb pulled out a knife. Looked like Fletcher's knife, the one with the carved handle. Hartwell laughed and said something about Webb being too much of a coward to use it. That's when Webb lost his temper. You saw Webb kill Hartwell? Saw him stab him, sure enough. Then he wiped the knife clean and dropped it next to the body. Looked around real careful, then walked away like nothing happened. Pete, why didn't you tell anyone this at the time? The old drunk had looked away shamefully. Who was going to believe a drunk over the town doctor? Besides, Webb came to see me the next day. Said if I ever mentioned seeing him that night, he'd make sure I ended up in the state asylum. Said a man could disappear real easy in a place like that. Armed with this information, Cowman had spent the rest of the night planning his next move. He couldn't simply accuse Dr. Webb without proof. Pete's testimony alone wouldn't be enough to convince anyone, especially given his reputation. But there was one person who might have the evidence he needed. That person was Emma Hartwell, Samuel's widow. Emma lived in a small house on the respectable side of town, surviving on her late husband's savings and the charity of the church. She'd been notably absent from the calls for the Fletcher children's removal, and Cowman had always wondered why. He found her tending her small garden in the early morning light, her face drawn with the permanent sadness of a woman who'd lost everything that mattered. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm Jake Morrison. I was wondering if I could speak with you about your husband. Emma looked up, her eyes wary. What about Samuel? About the night he died? About Dr. Webb? The color drained from Emma's face. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do, ma'am. I think you've known all along that Robert Fletcher didn't kill your husband. Emma's hands began to shake. You need to leave. Now. Mrs. Hartwell, 2 innocent children are about to be sent away forever because this town needs someone to blame for your husband's death. If you know something, anything, that could help them, please. Emma stood slowly, her eyes filling with tears. You don't understand. If I tell the truth, it won't just destroy Dr. Webb. It'll destroy me, too. What do you mean? Samuel wasn't the man people thought he was, Emma whispered. He'd been blackmailing Dr. Webb for months. Webb had been taking liberties with some of his female patients. Samuel found out and demanded money to keep quiet. The pieces began falling into place in Cowman's mind. Your husband was blackmailing Dr. Webb, and Webb finally decided he'd had enough. Samuel kept getting greedier, demanding more money. I begged him to stop, but he said we deserved to live comfortably after all the years of scraping by. He said Webb could afford it. Do you have proof of the blackmail? Emma nodded reluctantly. Samuel kept records, letters, payment receipts, everything. He said it was insurance in case Webb ever tried to back out of their arrangement. Where are these records now? Hidden in our root cellar. I've been too afraid to destroy them, but too afraid to come forward with them. Mrs. Hartwell, those children are going to be taken away today unless someone speaks up. Your husband may not have been perfect, but Robert Fletcher died for a crime he didn't commit. Are you willing to let his children pay the price for our town's mistake? Emma closed her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. If I come forward, everyone will know what Samuel was doing. His reputation will be ruined. His reputation is already gone, ma'am. But you can save 2 innocent children and clear the name of a man who died for nothing. After what seemed like an eternity, Emma nodded. I'll get the papers. An hour later, Cowman walked into the courthouse with Emma Hartwell at his side and a leather satchel full of evidence in his hands. The custody hearing was already in session, with Judge Morrison presiding over a packed courtroom. Tommy and Sarah Fletcher sat at the defendant's table, looking small and frightened in their clean county-issued clothes. Dr. Webb was in the middle of his testimony about the children's need for institutional care when Cowman's entrance caused a stir throughout the courtroom. "Your Honor," Cowman called out, "I have evidence that's directly relevant to these proceedings." Judge Morrison frowned. "Mr. Morrison, this is a custody hearing, not a criminal trial. With respect, Your Honor, it's about to become both." Mayor Harrison jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this man has no standing in these proceedings. He's simply trying to disrupt." "I'm trying to prevent a miscarriage of justice," Cowman interrupted. "Your Honor, I have evidence that Robert Fletcher was innocent of the murder of Samuel Hartwell. Evidence that proves the real killer has been sitting in this courtroom, demanding that Fletcher's children be sent away to hide his own guilt." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Dr. Webb's face had gone pale, but he maintained his composure. "Your Honor, this is clearly a desperate attempt to—" "Dr. Webb," Judge Morrison said firmly, "you'll have your chance to respond. Mr. Morrison, present your evidence." Cowman opened the satchel and began laying out the documents Emma had provided. "Your Honor, these are records kept by Samuel Hartwell documenting months of blackmail payments from Dr. Marcus Webb. They detail Webb's inappropriate conduct with female patients and his payments to keep Hartwell quiet." "This is preposterous," Dr. Webb shouted, but his voice cracked with fear. "Furthermore," Cowman continued, "I have a witness who saw Dr. Webb arguing with Hartwell on the night of the murder. A witness who saw Webb stab Hartwell with Robert Fletcher's stolen knife." Judge Morrison examined the documents carefully. "Mrs. Hartwell, are you prepared to testify that these documents are genuine?" Emma stood on shaking legs. "Yes, Your Honor. My husband was blackmailing Dr. Webb. I tried to stop him, but he wouldn't listen. He said Dr. Webb deserved to pay for what he'd done to those poor women." "You lying witch!" Dr. Webb snarled, his careful facade finally cracking. "You have no proof of anything." "Actually, we do," Sheriff Dalton said from the back of the courtroom. He'd been quietly investigating while Cowman gathered evidence. "I found 3 women willing to testify about Dr. Webb's conduct. They were too afraid to come forward before, but they're ready to speak now." Dr. Webb looked around the courtroom like a trapped animal. The faces that had once shown him respect now looked at him with disgust and horror. His reputation, his career, his entire life was crumbling before his eyes. "This is all lies!" he screamed. "I've served this community faithfully for 20 years. You can't believe the word of a drunk and a blackmailer's widow over mine." "What about the word of an innocent man who died for your crime?" Tommy Fletcher asked quietly. The simple question, asked in a child's clear voice, cut through all the adult complications and legal maneuvering. Dr. Webb stared at the boy whose father he'd condemned to death, and something broke inside him. "He wasn't supposed to be there," Webb whispered. "Hartwell said he'd meet me alone, but when I got there, Fletcher was with him. They were talking about the mining claims." The courtroom held its breath as Dr. Webb continued his confession. "Hartwell saw me and started laughing. Said now he had 2 sources of income, me and Fletcher. Said he'd tell everyone about my indiscretions unless I paid him even more money. I couldn't let that happen. I'd worked too hard to build my reputation." "So you killed him," Judge Morrison said quietly. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to scare him. But he kept laughing, kept threatening me. I grabbed Fletcher's knife. He dropped it earlier when he was working on the mining equipment. I lost control. And you let Robert Fletcher hang for your crime." Dr. Webb's voice was barely a whisper. "I thought they'd never convict him. I thought there wasn't enough evidence. When they actually sentenced him to death, I wanted to confess, but it was too late. If I'd spoken up then, everyone would have known I was guilty." The courtroom sat in stunned silence as the full weight of Dr. Webb's confession settled over them. Robert Fletcher had died an innocent man, condemned by a community too eager to believe the worst about an outsider. Judge Morrison's voice was heavy with emotion when he finally spoke. "Dr. Marcus Webb, you are under arrest for the murder of Samuel Hartwell and the wrongful death of Robert Fletcher. Sheriff Dalton, please take him into custody." As Dr. Webb was led away in shackles, Judge Morrison turned to Tommy and Sarah Fletcher. "Children, On behalf of this court and this community, I offer you our deepest apologies. A terrible wrong has been done to your family, and while we cannot bring your father back, we can ensure that you receive the care and respect you deserve. Your Honor, Cowman said, I'd like to formally request custody of Tommy and Sarah Fletcher, and I'd like to support that request, came a voice from the gallery. Mayor Harrison stood up, his face red with shame. Mr. Morrison has shown more courage and integrity than the rest of us combined. If he's willing to take responsibility for these children, the town will support him in every way possible. One by one, the other townspeople stood in agreement. Mrs. Thornton, Banker Carruthers, even the church ladies who had been so quick to condemn, all of them rising to show their support for the man who had fought for justice when they had chosen convenience. Tommy, Sarah, Judge Morrison asked gently, would you like to go home with Mr. Morrison? Tommy looked at his sister, then at Cowman. Will you tell us stories about Papa? Will you help us remember the good things about him? Every day, Cowman promised. Sarah's weak voice carried clearly through the courtroom. Papa always said the truth would come out eventually. He was right. As Cowman led Tommy and Sarah out of the courthouse, the entire town watched in silence. They had learned a hard lesson about the price of prejudice and the danger of rushing to judgment. But they had also learned something else, that sometimes, when the world seems darkest, a single person willing to stand up for what's right can change everything. 6 months later, Sarah Fletcher was healthy and strong, running through the fields of Cowman's ranch with the energy of a normal 8-year-old. Tommy had grown 3 inches and gained 20 pounds, and his eyes had lost that haunted look of premature wisdom. The town of Dustridge had changed too. Dr. Webb's trial and conviction had forced them to confront their own capacity for injustice, and they'd worked hard to become the kind of community that Robert Fletcher had hoped to find when he'd first arrived with his children. Cowman had changed most of all. The walls around his heart had come down, replaced by the laughter of children and the warmth of a family he'd never expected to have. He'd learned that sometimes the greatest courage isn't in facing down an enemy, but in opening yourself up to love again. And on quiet evenings, when Tommy and Sarah asked him to tell them stories about their father, Cowman would speak of Robert Fletcher not as the town had seen him, an outsider, a suspected criminal, but as he truly was. A loving father who had died protecting his children's future, and whose memory would live on in the family that had grown from his sacrifice. The truth had indeed come out, just as Robert Fletcher had promised. And with it came redemption, not just for his children, but for an entire town that had learned the true meaning of justice. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new, amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.